top secret file, codenamed Sierra 77, vanished from no search. The thieves didn't know their digital crime triggered a forgotten analog alarm. A quiet, white-haired old woman sweeping the floors of the army base. To the young soldiers at Fort Jackson, she was just Ellie, the old woman who cleaned the armory. A ghost in beige overalls, she moved through their world of shouted commands and high-tech warfare with a broom and a dustpan, utterly invisible. They saw the roadmap of wrinkles on her face, the slight stoop of her shoulders that spoke of a long, hard life, and the gentle way she handled her cleaning supplies. In their eyes, she was a relic, a harmless grandmotherly figure deserving of a kind of distant, dismissive pity. "Mind your step, ma'am," a young private, barely out of his teens, would call out, jogging past without ever meeting her eyes. "Ellie, you missed a spot by locker 7. A sharp-faced corporal would bark, pointing with a tablet, his tone laced with the impatience of youth. Ellie would simply offer a quiet nod, a faint, polite smile touching the corners of her lips, and shuffle over to address the supposed oversight. She rarely spoke, content to exist in the background, a silent observer. Her work, however, was a language only a select few could ever hope to understand. When she cleaned an M4 carbine, her gnarled fingers weren't just wiping away carbon residue. They moved with a diagnostic intimacy, tracing the lines of the weapon. She could feel a hairline fracture in a firing pin that a dozen inspections had missed, or the subtle warp in a barrel that would send a round a fraction of an inch wide at 500 meters. Her movements, which the young men saw as slow and feeble, were a masterclass in economy. No wasted motion, no surplus energy expended. Every gesture had a purpose, honed by a lifetime they couldn't possibly imagine. She watched them on the firing range, her gaze not nostalgic, but deeply analytical. She wasn't reliving her youth. She was cataloging their weaknesses. The way one recruit's stance was too wide, a recipe for fatigue in a prolonged firefight. The way another flinched a millisecond before pulling the trigger, a fatal tell. She was a human database of combat flaws hidden behind a gentle, unassuming facade. She was the quietest person on the base, and by far the most observant. While they saw a janitor, Eleanor Vance was conducting the most thorough operational readiness inspection Fort Jackson had seen in decades. She just needed to find what she was looking for. Sergeant Major Reyes was a man carved from the granite of 3 decades in the service. He'd seen every kind of soldier imaginable, from prodigious talents to outright frauds, and his eyes missed nothing. Visiting Fort Jackson to observe the new training cycle, his gaze drifted past the recruits, past the bellowing drill instructors, and settled on the old woman picking up spent brass casings. He watched Ellie bend down. It wasn't the slow, pained creak of old age he expected. It was a fluid, perfectly balanced motion, a single knee dropping to the ground, back straight, head up, a textbook field medic's kneel. It conserved energy, kept the center of gravity low, and allowed for maximum situational awareness. Reyes's eyebrow twitched. Odd. Then, a recruit fumbled a magazine change, his hands clumsy with nerves. A drill instructor got in his face, unleashing a torrent of creative insults. From 20 yards away, over the crack of rifle fire, Reyes heard the old janitor mutter something under her breath, so quiet it was almost lost on the wind. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. It was a common enough mantra in the special operations community, but the cadence, the specific rhythm of the words, was ancient. A ghost on the airwaves. Reyes's head snapped toward Ellie. He looked closer, his expert eyes scanning for details, and then he saw it. The old, scuffed wristwatch on her arm. It wasn't worn on the outside of her wrist like a normal person. It was strapped to the inside, the face protected, hidden. A simple, practical measure to prevent the sun from glinting off the crystal and giving away a sniper's position. It was a signature, the signature of a unit that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. That evening, the air in the maintenance closet off the armory was thick with the smell of solvent and old metal. The only sound was the rhythmic slide of a cleaning rod down a rifle barrel. Sergeant Major Reyes entered, his combat boots making no sound on the worn concrete floor. Ellie didn't look up from the M16A4 trigger assembly she was meticulously wiping down. She sat on a low wooden stool, bathed in the harsh light of a single bare bulb, the very picture of harmless fragility. Reyes stood in the doorway for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, taut and heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tight, meant only for her. That phrase he used on the range. Slow is smooth. And the watch. He took a half step into the room. I've only ever heard of one unit that wore their watches on the inside of the wrist like that. I thought they were all gone. Ellie didn't stop her work. She didn't look up, but for a fraction of a second, her hands paused. It was an infinitesimal hesitation, a skipped heartbeat in the steady rhythm of her task. Then she resumed, but everything had changed. The motion was no longer the careful, deliberate work of an old woman. Her hands became a blur of impossible, practiced efficiency. The hammer, the trigger, the disconnector. She reassembled the core of the weapon by touch alone, her eyes finally lifting to lock onto his. The gentle, vacant look was gone. In its place was an intensity that felt like chipped ice, a gaze so piercing it made the decorated sergeant major feel like a raw recruit on his first day. Her hand slid across the workbench and pushed a single, gleaming object toward him. It was a 7.62 millimeters round, its brass casing polished to a dull shine, the kind used in a Dragunov sniper rifle. She tapped it once with her index finger, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. "Some things are better left buried, Sergeant Major," Ellie said. Her voice was no longer a frail whisper, but a quiet rasp of absolute authority. "Make sure you aren't one of them." It wasn't a threat. It was a command, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had given orders that shaped nations. Reyes, a man whose bark could make a full bird colonel flinch, felt a knot of pure, primal fear tighten in his stomach. He gave a short, sharp nod, his face pale under the fluorescent light. The power in the cramped room had just irrevocably shifted, and the most dangerous person on this entire base wasn't the one with stripes on his sleeve. Sergeant Major Reyes walked out of that maintenance closet a changed man. The next morning, he was seen speaking urgently on a secure phone line, his back pressed against a wall, his voice a low, frantic murmur. An hour later, he was standing in the office of the base commander, Colonel Davenport. Davenport was a man who wore his ambition like a second uniform, a politician in combat boots who saw his command at Fort Jackson as a stepping stone to a star in a desk at the Pentagon. "She's a volunteer janitor," Reyes, Davenport said, waving a dismissive hand, a confident smirk playing on his lips. "An old-timer. Probably has some stories, but let's not lose our minds over a bit of scuttlebutt." Reyes leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the colonel's polished mahogany desk. He spoke, his voice too low for the aide outside the door to hear. He uttered only a few short sentences, but they contained two words: Valkyrie program. Colonel Davenport's smirk dissolved as if it were made of smoke. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, horrified pallor. He stared at Reyes, his mouth slightly agape, as if the sergeant major had just calmly informed him that the sky was on fire. The ripple effect was almost immediate. The atmosphere on the base began to change in subtle, unnerving ways. When Ellie shuffled past the command building with her broom and dustpan, Colonel Davenport, who was walking out, froze mid-stride. He stumbled backward, dropping his leather briefcase with a loud clatter. Papers scattered across the pavement as he flattened himself against the wall, stammering apologies to let the old woman pass. A young captain, the same one who had impatiently told Ellie to hurry it up with the trash cans just days prior, now practically sprinted ahead of her to hold open the door to the mess hall. He then insisted on taking her garbage bin from her, stammering, "Allow me, ma'am, please." "It's an honor." The recruits were the most confused. They saw what was happening, but they couldn't possibly comprehend it. They watched as hardened drill instructors, men who seemed to fear nothing in heaven or on earth, would snap to a rigid, almost comical brace when the old janitor walked by, only to relax into an awkward slump once she was gone. The whispers started in the barracks, growing wilder with each passing day. Who was this old woman? A secret billionaire doing a social experiment? A senator's mother in disguise? Was she a clandestine inspector from the Department of Defense? Through it all, Eleanor Vance remained unchanged. She swept the floors. She wiped down the tables. She cleaned the rifles. She seemed utterly oblivious to the silent, widening circle of fear and awe that was forming around her. Her placid demeanor only amplified the tension. It was like watching a sleeping lioness, knowing that at any moment, those tired eyes could open and the world would end. The mystery of the old janitor was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a legend. The tension finally boiled over in the controlled chaos of the officers' mess. Lieutenant Grant, a cocky West Point graduate with a jawline as sharp as his ambition, slammed his tray down on the table where Sergeant Major Reyes was sitting alone. "I want to know what's going on." "Sergeant Major," Grant demanded, his voice loud enough to carry across the room, turning heads. "This entire base is walking on eggshells around a janitor. It's absurd. Command is paralyzed. What did you tell the colonel?" Reyes looked up, his eyes weary. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 48 hours. He gestured for the lieutenant to sit. "Lower your voice, son. You're making a fool of yourself." "I want an explanation," Grant insisted, though he sat down, his posture aggressive. Reyes let out a long sigh, the sound of a man tired of guarding a secret too heavy to carry alone. "You see an old woman, Lieutenant. You see a janitor. Your eyes work, but you don't see a thing." He leaned forward slightly. "That watch she wears on the inside of her wrist, that wasn't just a personal quirk. It was the uniform of a unit that officially never existed. In the late 60s, early 70s, when an operation went so sideways that the agency and the military had to disavow it completely, they'd send in one person to clean it up. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts. They called it the Valkyrie program." Grant scoffed. "A ghost story? Is that what has a 2-star general's command shaking in its boots?" "They were troubleshooters," Reyes shot back, his voice a low growl that silenced the lieutenant's smirk. "Sent in alone to prevent wars, to dismantle terror networks, to do the things no one else could or would. The official story is that the program was a catastrophic failure and the entire unit was wiped out in a black ops somewhere in Southeast Asia in '75. It was buried, but the legend always said one of them got out. The first one, the woman who wrote their operational doctrine, the one they called Valkyrie One." Reyes leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "Her name is Eleanor Vance. The woman you see sweeping floors single-handedly wrote the book on unconventional warfare that your professors at West Point are still trying to understand." Grant stared, his arrogance finally cracking. He didn't believe it. Not yet. But the seed of a terrifying doubt had been planted. The proof arrived the next day from the sky. The distinct, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a Black Hawk helicopter echoed across the base, a sound that always meant a visitor of profound importance. It didn't land at the designated VIP helipad. It touched down directly on the grass field next to Rifle Range 7, kicking up a storm of dust and dry grass. The entire base seemed to hold its collective breath. Out stepped a 4-star general, his uniform crisp, his shoulders heavy with the weight of command. General Morrison, the head of Special Operations Command. He strode across the field with an urgent purpose, ignoring the frantic salute of Colonel Davenport, who had run out to meet him. Morrison walked right past the base commander as if he were a piece of furniture and came to a stop on the firing line. He stood before Ellie, who was quietly watching a group of recruits practice. The young soldiers looked on, confused. A few snickered, one whispering to his friend, "Looks like the old lady is finally in real trouble." General Morrison did not yell. He did not reprimand. He stood before the stooped janitor and spoke with a tone of the deepest, most profound respect, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Valkyrie One, we received your signal." The smirks on the recruits' faces evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed, slack-jawed disbelief. Lieutenant Grant, who had been observing the drill, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Morrison turned to the assembled soldiers, his voice now booming with authority. For those of you who are confused, let me be clear. The woman standing before you, this woman you know as Ellie, has a service record that is sealed above my own pay grade. She is credited with single-handedly preventing 3 separate wars, dismantling 2 international syndicates, and rescuing more high-value assets than any single SEAL team in the last 50 years. The woman you have watched sweep these floors designed the very infiltration tactics your instructors are teaching you. And she found them wanting. He turned back to Ellie. The power dynamic of the entire base had not just been shattered. It had been vaporized. The old woman wasn't a ghost. She was a god. Morrison's gaze was fixed on her, the question hanging in the air, heavy and urgent. Your signal. The Sierra 77 protocol. It was a fail-safe, a break glass in case of Armageddon alarm. It hasn't been active in my lifetime. Why now, Ellie? Why are you here? All eyes were on the old woman. The frail, shuffling janitor was gone. She stood up straight, the stoop in her shoulders vanishing as if it had been a costume she'd just shrugged off. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, a blade honed by years of command. I'm not here because of something that happened 50 years ago, General, Ellie said, her eyes scanning the faces of the stunned officers. I'm here because of what happened last Tuesday. The thieves think they stole a data file, an intelligence asset. They're wrong. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Sierra 77 isn't a file full of data. It's a person, Oignon, a cryptographer working on next-generation security for the agency. She looked directly at Morrison, her expression hardening into granite. And she's my granddaughter. She didn't just let them take her. She had a message for me inside the breach itself. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. This wasn't about old history. This was active, personal, and happening right now. Just as Morrison began to process the implications, a sudden, violent movement broke the stunned silence. Lieutenant Grant drew his sidearm with terrifying speed, but he didn't aim it at Ellie. He aimed it directly at General Morrison, grabbing the general's shoulder and pulling him close as a human shield. She's right, General, Grant snarled, his handsome face twisting into a mask of fanaticism. The lock is here, and you just lost the key. Simultaneously, 2 other soldiers standing nearby drew their weapons, aiming them at the loyal officers. In the distance, a thunderous explosion rocked the base, a column of black smoke climbing into the sky from the direction of the ammunition depot. The theoretical threat had just become brutally, physically real. The time for talking was over. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting in confusion and fear. But in the heart of the storm, Eleanor Vance was an island of perfect calm. Reyes perimeter. General, get down, she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. She moved with a speed that defied her age, shoving a heavy equipment table over to create a makeshift barrier. The mask was completely off. From a reinforced inner pocket of her janitor's overalls, she produced a compact SIG P365 pistol and a small, flesh-colored radio earpiece, which she fitted in her ear with a single practice motion. Valkyrie One is active. She spoke into a tiny microphone on her collar. Protocol Chimera is in effect. All friendly assets rally to me. Her transformation from a passive, overlooked old woman to an active field commander was absolute and terrifying to behold. The recruits were frozen, paralyzed by the sudden violence. Ellie didn't have time for their fear. She darted toward the nearest one, a boy of no more than 19, and snatched the M4 rifle from his hands. It was a weapon she had likely cleaned 100 times. Your stance is too wide, son. You'll get tired, she barked, her voice the familiar rasp of a drill instructor, reflexively correcting the recruit's terrified posture even as hostile rounds began to snap through the air. Grant and his 2 conspirators were laying down a sheet of suppressive fire from behind a concrete barrier. Grant was using the 4-star general as a shield, peering around his side to fire. It was an impossible shot. The loyal soldiers hesitated, unwilling to risk hitting Morrison. Ellie showed no such hesitation. She dropped to one knee, the rifle feeling like an extension of her own body. She took a single, measured breath, her cheek welded to the stock. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. A single, sharp crack echoed from her M4. But the round didn't fly toward Grant. It streaked downrange and struck the heavy steel support arm of a target stand at the 100-meter line. The 5.56 millimeters bullet ricocheted at a precise, calculated angle. A 1 in a billion shot, a geometric miracle of violence. The deflected round zipped back across the range and slammed into Grant's firing hand, shattering the pistol and the bones holding it. Grant screamed, a raw sound of pain and disbelief, and collapsed. The other two traitors, stunned by the impossible display of marksmanship, froze for a fatal second. It was all the opening Sergeant Major Reyes and the other loyal soldiers needed. With the firefight over, Ellie stood up. She strode over to the whimpering Lieutenant Grant, grabbed a handful of his uniform, and hauled him to his feet. The explosion was a diversion, Ellie stated, her voice cold iron. My granddaughter. You are moving her for extraction. Where is she? Grant, his face a mess of terror and pain, looked past Ellie, his eyes pointing toward a concrete maintenance hatch set into the ground. Service tunnels under the base to the old airfield. Ellie looked at Reyes, her eyes already tracing the path in her mind. They're moving her right now. In the dark, musty service tunnels beneath the base, Ellie became a ghost. Leading Reyes and a small team, she moved with an unnerving confidence, using her encyclopedic knowledge of the base's old architecture to outmaneuver the extraction team. In a swift, silent confrontation in the echoing dark, they were neutralized. Her granddaughter, Anya, shaken but unharmed, was safe. Back on the surface, General Morrison approached Ellie, who now stood with an arm around the young woman she had just rescued. Ellie, Morrison began, his voice thick with emotion. The country owes you a debt it can never repay. Again, Ellie didn't look at the general. She just looked out toward the horizon, her gaze distant, analytical. This was just one cell, General. The network that did this is still out there. She patted her granddaughter's arm gently. And the list she gave me is very long. The legend of the janitor was over. The work of the Valkyrie had just begun. If you believe in honoring the quiet professionals and unseen heroes who protect us, subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories. Like and share this story to ensure their legacy of courage is never forgotten. Please comment respect to honor heroes like Eleanor.